A chance encounter. The streets of New York were alive with the sounds, smells, and sights of the annual multicultural festival. Brightly colored banners fluttered in the breeze, food vendors from every corner of the globe cooked up fragrant dishes, and the hum of music mixed with the excited chatter of the crowd. David strolled through the festival, hands in his pockets, his sketchbook tucked under his arm. His eyes took in the scene with an artist's appreciation, lingering on details that others might overlook. A child laughing as he chased a balloon, an elderly couple swaying to the beat of a distant drum, or a group of dancers spinning in sync. For David, this festival was a reminder of the city's diversity and a place where he found inspiration. Yet, despite the celebration around him, a sense of frustration lingered within him. Just that morning, he had received his 20th rejection letter from a gallery. They all used the same polite, coded language. Too urban, not quite what we're looking for, or the most biting of all, not commercially viable. He knew what they really meant. His art was too black, his subjects too real. It felt like he was always creating in a world that refused to see him. As he walked, he noticed a young woman standing at the edge of the crowd, looking lost. She was clutching her phone tightly, her face pale with worry as she looked around, clearly out of her element. Her clothing screamed Upper East Side, with her designer bag and carefully curated appearance. Everything about her seemed polished and proper, a stark contrast to the vibrant chaos surrounding her. David's first instinct was to keep walking, not wanting to intrude. Yet something in her eyes, a flicker of vulnerability, a hint of panic, made him pause. He approached her slowly, maintaining a respectful distance. "Excuse me, miss," he said, his voice calm and steady. "Are you okay? You seem a bit lost." The woman, startled, looked up at him. She managed a tight, forced smile, though her eyes betrayed her apprehension. "I'm fine," she replied quickly, a little too quickly, as if trying to convince herself as much as him. But as she looked down at her phone and the blank screen, she sighed, her shoulders slumping. "Actually, my phone died, and I don't know how to get back." David could see the discomfort in her posture, the way her body language seemed closed off. He recognized that look all too well, the fear, the doubt. Growing up in a neighborhood that others might label as dangerous or rough, he knew how some people perceived him based on his skin color and appearance. He also knew that every interaction was a balance, a careful choice between offering help and respecting boundaries. But seeing her so out of place, he couldn't bring himself to walk away. "Look," he offered gently, pulling out his own phone, "I can help you get your bearings. Do you know the address you need to go to?" She hesitated, glancing around nervously before finally nodding. "It's 86th and Lexington," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. David nodded. "That's on the Upper East Side. You're a bit far from there," he said, trying to keep his tone neutral. He brought up the map on his phone and handed it to her, allowing her to check the directions herself. As she took the phone, he noticed her hands were shaking slightly. She whispered a quiet "thank you," and for a moment, the tension between them seemed to ease. He smiled, trying to lighten the mood. The festival can be overwhelming if you're not used to it. Lots of people, loud music, it's easy to get lost. She glanced at him, a hint of curiosity in her gaze. "Yeah, I didn't think it would be like this," she admitted, her voice softer now. "I've never been to this part of the city before." David nodded, sensing an opportunity to bridge the gap between them. "I get that. It's different from the Upper East Side, but it's got its own beauty, its own stories." He gestured to a nearby food stall where the scent of spices filled the air. "Have you ever tried Vietnamese food?" She looked at him, surprised by the question. "No, I haven't," she replied, her voice tinged with curiosity. "Come on," David said, nodding towards the stall. "Let me treat you. It's worth a try. And while you're here, you might as well experience the festival." She hesitated, glancing around again, but something in his expression made her relax. Maybe it was his easygoing smile, or perhaps it was his sincerity. Whatever the reason, she nodded, following him to the stall. As they waited for their food, he noticed her stealing glances at him, her expression softening. After a few minutes, they were handed 2 steaming bowls. David showed her how to hold the chopsticks, guiding her as she awkwardly tried to mimic his movements. She laughed as she struggled, and he found himself chuckling along with her. They sat down on a nearby bench, and she took her first bite, her eyes widening in surprise at the burst of flavors. "This is amazing," she said, a genuine smile spreading across her face. "I've never tasted anything like it." David grinned, taking a bite of his own. "Welcome to the world outside of the Upper East Side. There's a lot more to the city than designer stores and coffee shops." For the first time, he saw her truly relax. She was no longer the nervous, lost woman clutching her phone. Instead, she seemed genuinely interested, asking him about the festival, the different cuisines, and the cultures represented. David found himself sharing stories about his neighborhood, his experiences, and even his struggles as an artist. He told her about the rejection letters, the way his work was often dismissed as too real or too raw. She listened intently, her expression shifting from curiosity to empathy. "I grew up in a world where everything was safe, controlled," she admitted, her voice soft. "I was never exposed to any of this. I went to a private school, lived in a gated community. My parents always said it was for my safety, but I don't know. It feels like I missed out on so much." David nodded, understanding the sentiment. "It's not just about where you're from," he said gently. "It's about being open to other experiences, other perspectives. That's how you grow." They continued talking, their conversation flowing easily despite their differences. It was as if, for a moment, they were just 2 people sharing a meal and a connection, freed from the stereotypes and judgments of the world around them. As the sun began to set, casting a warm golden glow over the festival, David noticed a familiar face in the crowd, a former classmate named Marcus, who had always carried himself with an air of superiority. Marcus's gaze shifted to David and the woman, a smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth as he approached. Well, David," Marcus sneered. "Still trying to play artist, I see. And now you're a tour guide for lost tourists." David felt his face flush, a mixture of embarrassment and anger bubbling up. He saw the woman's expression shift, her eyes narrowing as she looked at Marcus, clearly picking up on his condescension. "Actually," she said, her voice steady and clear, "David has been showing me parts of the city I never knew existed. He's incredibly talented and insightful, more than you'll ever understand." Marcus's smirk faltered, clearly caught off guard by her response. David felt a surge of gratitude and pride, not just for her words, but for the courage it took for her to stand up to someone like Marcus. In that moment, he realized that the day had turned out to be far more meaningful than he could have ever anticipated. They stood side by side, an unlikely pair, yet somehow it felt like they had both learned something invaluable. Unlikely companions. As the festival swirled around them, David and Lily continued their walk, moving from one booth to another, each step feeling like they were crossing boundaries they hadn't known existed. David guided her through a world of sounds, scents, and sights that she'd never experienced, giving her a glimpse of life beyond the pristine, carefully manicured world she had always known. They stopped at a Nigerian art stall where vibrant paintings covered in hues of red, blue, and green depicted scenes of community life. The artist, a tall woman with an infectious smile, greeted them warmly. She noticed David admiring one of her pieces and struck up a conversation about the symbolism in her work. Lily stood back, watching the exchange, noticing how David's eyes sparkled as he talked about art. She had never seen anyone so passionate about what they did. For her, art had always been something to be admired from a distance, hanging on museum walls, silent and untouchable. David, You really know your art, Lily said, genuinely impressed, as they moved on. He shrugged modestly. I try. Art has always been my escape, a way to make sense of everything. Why do you need an escape? She asked, her voice softening. David hesitated, but something about Lily's expression encouraged him to open up. When I was growing up, it was hard to find places where I felt like I belonged. My mom raised me by herself. She worked 2 jobs to keep a roof over our heads. We didn't have much, but she always made sure I had pencils and paper. She'd say, "Draw your dreams, David, and one day they might come true." Lily's gaze dropped. Her cheeks flushed with an emotion she wasn't used to showing. She'd never had to struggle for anything. Her parents had given her every opportunity, every tool to succeed. Yet here was David, someone who'd had none of those privileges, and he still stood before her, resilient and proud. I didn't mean to pry, she said softly. David gave her a reassuring smile. It's all right. I'm proud of where I come from, even if others don't always see its value. Their conversation was interrupted by a loud crash nearby, followed by laughter and applause. They turned to see a group of drummers setting up for a performance. Lily watched, captivated, as the drummers began, their rhythm infecting the crowd with energy. People clapped along, some even dancing, swept up in the beat. Lily glanced at David, a spark of excitement in her eyes. I've never seen anything like this, she admitted. David chuckled. It's called a West African drum circle. The rhythm and energy are contagious, aren't they? Without thinking, Lily reached for his hand, pulling him closer to the performance. David felt a slight jolt of surprise at the gesture, but allowed himself to be led. They stood side by side, watching as the drummers performed with an intensity that seemed to shake the air around them. People danced freely, abandoning any inhibitions, and for a brief moment, David and Lily found themselves caught up in that same spirit. Come on, David said, grinning. Let's join in. What? Me? Lily laughed, half shocked and half delighted by his suggestion. Yes, you, he insisted, tugging her gently into the crowd. They moved awkwardly at first, laughing at themselves, but soon they fell into the rhythm, letting the beat guide their steps. Lily felt a strange sense of freedom wash over her, a release from the constraints of her usual polished and perfect life. She was dancing in the middle of a diverse crowd, sharing an unspoken connection with people she'd never met and would likely never see again. In that moment, David and Lily were simply 2 people moving to the same beat, no labels or judgments, just 2 souls enjoying life. When the drumming finally ended, they were both breathless, their laughter mingling with the applause that erupted from the crowd. Thank you, Lily said, catching her breath as they walked away from the circle. I haven't felt that free in, well, maybe ever. David looked at her thoughtfully. Sometimes we just need to let go of who we think we should be. They walked in silence for a while, a comfortable silence, as they took in the various sights around them. Eventually, they stopped at another booth, this one run by an elderly Dominican artist selling hand-painted jewelry. Lily admired that delicate bracelet with intricate patterns and bright colors, running her fingers over the small beads. Try it on, David encouraged, sensing her hesitation. Lily looked at him, surprised. You think it would suit me? David smiled. Absolutely. Art isn't about fitting a mold. It's about expression. If it speaks to you, it's yours. She tried on the bracelet, and as she looked at it on her wrist, a warm feeling spread through her. She glanced at the artist, who nodded approvingly, saying something in Spanish that she didn't understand. David translated with a chuckle. She said it looks like it was made for you. Lily's cheeks flushed with pleasure, and she bought the bracelet, slipping it back on her wrist as they continued their walk. As they strolled through the festival, Lily found herself opening up to David in ways she hadn't anticipated. She told him about her life on the Upper East Side, her sheltered upbringing, and how she always felt like something was missing, though she couldn't quite put her finger on it. "I've spent my whole life following a path that was laid out for me," she confessed. "Good schools, high expectations, the constant pressure to be perfect. But today, here, it feels like I'm finally seeing the world for what it is." David listened, nodding sympathetically. Sometimes, stepping out of our comfort zone is the only way to find what we're really looking for. Lily looked at him, her eyes filled with gratitude. "Thank you, David. You didn't have to help me, but you did. And now I feel like I've gained something priceless." David shrugged modestly. "Kindness doesn't cost anything. It's something my mom always taught me. If you see someone in need, you help. Simple as that." They continued exploring the festival, sampling dishes from different countries, and learning about cultures from around the world. David found himself surprised by Lily's genuine curiosity and openness, qualities he hadn't expected from someone with her background. She asked questions, listened intently, and absorbed each new experience like a sponge. As evening approached, the sky turned a brilliant shade of orange and pink. The festival began to wind down, and a sense of melancholy crept in as they realized their time together was coming to an end. They found a quiet spot near a fountain, watching as people slowly started to pack up their booths. "I should probably head back," Lily said, her voice tinged with reluctance. David nodded. "Yeah, I guess so." They stood in silence for a moment, neither wanting to say goodbye. Lily shifted uncomfortably, looking down at the bracelet on her wrist. "I'll never forget this day, David. Thank you for everything." David smiled, but there was a hint of sadness in his eyes. "I'll remember it too, Lily. You reminded me that there are still people out there willing to see beyond the surface." As they exchanged a final look, a familiar voice called out behind them, "David, I've been looking all over for you." They turned to see Marcus, the same classmate who had sneered at David earlier. His smug grin returned as he noticed Lily standing next to David, and his gaze shifted from David to Lily, his eyes narrowing in judgment. Well, isn't this a surprise?" Marcus said, a mocking tone in his voice. "Didn't think I'd see the two of you together." David felt his jaw tighten, a surge of anger bubbling up. He didn't want Marcus to ruin the memory of this day, but the man's condescending smirk and dismissive tone were hard to ignore. Lily, sensing David's discomfort, stepped forward. "Marcus, is it?" she said, her voice calm but firm. "David has shown me more kindness and respect today than anyone I've ever met. Maybe you should try doing the same." Marcus's expression faltered, clearly taken aback by her response. He tried to recover, laughing awkwardly. "Just having a little fun, that's all." But Lily wasn't backing down. She met his gaze with a steely determination that left Marcus speechless. David watched the exchange, a mixture of pride and gratitude swelling in his chest. In that moment, he realized that this day had changed him too. He had started the day feeling dismissed, rejected, and unseen. But now, standing beside Lily, he felt seen in a way he never had before. As Marcus walked away, visibly uncomfortable, Lily turned to David and smiled. "Shall we?" They continued their walk, now bound not only by their shared experience, but by the quiet understanding that they had each found something they hadn't known they were looking for. A true connection that transcended backgrounds, judgments, and stereotypes. Barriers began to fall. As they wandered away from the confrontation with Marcus, an unspoken bond grew between David and Lily, strengthening with each step. They resumed exploring the festival, moving past stalls showcasing various cultures: Mexican, Indian, Ethiopian, Haitian. The richness of the world around them felt like a protective cocoon, allowing them both to be vulnerable in ways they hadn't anticipated. David led Lily to a small, brightly painted booth decorated with paper lanterns and wind chimes. It belonged to an elderly Japanese man, Mr. Tanaka, who made delicate origami art. He greeted David with a warm smile and a respectful nod, clearly recognizing him. "David-san," Mr. Tanaka said in a quiet, reverent tone, bowing slightly. "Good to see you, as always." David bowed in return. Good to see you too, Mr. Tanaka. I brought a friend today. This is Lily. Lily smiled, mirroring their small bow, though a bit clumsily. Mr. Tanaka's face lit up, and he extended his hands, offering her a piece of intricately folded paper shaped like a crane. A crane for good luck, he said, his English thickly accented but clear. To wish you peace and prosperity. Lily took the origami crane gently, her eyes widening as she examined the intricate folds. Thank you so much. This is beautiful, she said, genuinely moved by the gesture. She looked over at David. How do you know him? David smiled, his voice soft with nostalgia. Mr. Tanaka used to own a small art gallery in Brooklyn. When I was a kid, I'd sneak in sometimes, just to look at the art. He'd always welcome me, let me wander around, and even taught me a few things about Japanese art. He's been like a mentor to me. Mr. Tanaka's eyes glimmered as he patted David's shoulder. David-san has great talent. One day, his art will be known by many. Lily watched the exchange, feeling both admiration and a bit of shame. Growing up, she'd only seen art as something you admired in galleries or bought to decorate homes. She had never thought of it as a language, a bridge that connected people from different walks of life. When they said their goodbyes to Mr. Tanaka and walked away, Lily broke the silence. I'm realizing how much I don't know, she confessed, looking down at the crane in her hand. This whole world of art, of different cultures. It's like I've been living in a bubble. David nodded, understanding her sentiment. It's not uncommon. We all get wrapped up in our own worlds, especially when we're not encouraged to look beyond them. They continued down the path, stopping at a stall selling vibrant saris and traditional Indian jewelry. Lily's eyes sparkled as she admired the colorful fabrics, the intricately woven patterns catching the sunlight. You'd look good in one of those, David said with a small smile, gesturing to a deep blue sari decorated with silver embroidery. Lily laughed, half in jest and half shyly. I wouldn't even know how to wear it. The stall owner, a kind-faced woman named Priya, overheard and offered to show Lily how to drape it. Within minutes, Lily was transformed, the fabric wrapped elegantly around her as Priya adjusted the folds with expert hands. Lily looked at her reflection in a nearby mirror, her eyes widening in surprise at the graceful stranger staring back. Wow, she whispered, momentarily speechless. David looked at her, his expression softening. You look amazing, he said, the words slipping out before he could stop himself. Lily blushed, her cheeks warming as she felt his gaze linger on her. She took off the sari and handed it back to Priya, thanking her. I think I need to ease into this cultural exploration, she said with a chuckle, trying to hide her flustered expression. As they moved on, the festival began to wind down, the crowds thinning as the sun started to set. They walked in comfortable silence, the golden hues of the evening light casting a warm glow on their surroundings. Lily's phone, which had died earlier, finally sprang to life after she managed to charge it briefly at a booth. She glanced at her screen and saw several missed calls and messages from her friends, who had all left without her. Looks like my friends went back without me, she murmured, feeling a pang of irritation mixed with relief. Her friends would never have appreciated this experience the way she had today, and she felt grateful to have shared it with someone who truly understood it. Guess you're stuck with me a little longer, David teased lightly. She smiled. I think I prefer it that way. They found a quiet bench near a small fountain and sat down, the sound of water trickling providing a calming backdrop to the evening. The sky was turning shades of pink and purple, the last remnants of daylight, fading as night crept in. After a few moments of silence, Lily turned to David, her voice hesitant. David, can I ask you something personal? He looked at her, sensing the seriousness in her tone. Of course. She took a deep breath, gathering her thoughts. How do you stay so strong? I mean, dealing with people like Marcus, with all the rejection from galleries, and yet you still hold on to your dreams. I don't think I'd have the resilience for that." David looked away, his gaze fixed on the fountain as he thought about her question. "I don't know if it's strength. Sometimes it's just survival. My mom used to say that if you stop fighting, you start disappearing. I've felt invisible so many times in my life, pushed aside, dismissed. Art is my way of existing, of saying, I'm here, and I matter." Lily listened, her heart aching with a mixture of admiration and sadness. She reached out, placing her hand on his, giving it a gentle squeeze. "You do matter, David. And your art, it's incredible. The world just hasn't caught up yet." Her words hung in the air, carrying a warmth that softened something inside him. For the first time in a long while, he felt seen, not just as an artist, but as a person with dreams, fears, and hopes. "Thank you, Lily," he said quietly, his voice laced with gratitude. "You have no idea how much that means to me." They sat there in silence, both lost in their thoughts, letting the comfort of their connection fill the spaces between them. As the festival lights flickered on, casting a soft glow over the square, they knew this day would leave an indelible mark on them both. Just as they were preparing to leave, Lily's phone buzzed again. It was her father, and she could tell by his repeated calls that he was starting to worry. She sighed, realizing she couldn't avoid him much longer. "I should probably go," she said reluctantly, standing up. David nodded, a twinge of disappointment in his chest. "Yeah, of course. I'm glad I could show you around today." She hesitated, then impulsively wrapped her arms around him in a hug. He stiffened for a moment, surprised, before relaxing into it, letting himself savor the warmth of the embrace. When she pulled back, there was a look in her eyes, something vulnerable and honest. "I don't want this to be goodbye," she said softly. David's face softened. "It doesn't have to be. Let's keep in touch. Maybe I can introduce you to a few more spots around the city sometime." She nodded, a smile breaking through her reluctance. "I'd like that." As she turned to leave, David watched her go, a strange mix of emotions whirling in his chest. For the first time in a long time, he felt hope, not just for his art or his career, but for the possibility of connections that could cross the invisible boundaries that society so often imposed. When Lily disappeared into the distance, David sat back on the bench, taking a deep breath, feeling the weight of the day settle around him. He pulled out his sketchbook, flipping to a blank page, and began to draw. This time, he wasn't just drawing a scene. He was capturing a feeling, a memory that he knew he'd hold close for a long time. The image took shape under his pencil. The festival, the colors, the people, and in the center, an outline of Lily, standing with him amidst the vibrancy of it all. Confronting the past. Days passed since that unforgettable day of the festival, but David couldn't shake the memory of Lily. Her openness, curiosity, and willingness to step out of her comfort zone had surprised him. And he found himself replaying their conversations in his mind. For him, it was rare to find someone who genuinely listened, who looked beyond appearances and stereotypes. Lily, in her tentative yet determined way, had done just that. Meanwhile, Lily's experience at the festival had left a deep impression. She couldn't stop thinking about the stories David had shared, the vibrancy of the cultures she'd experienced, and most of all, the reality he had shown her, a reality she'd previously been blind to. As someone who had been insulated in privilege, it was like David had lifted a veil, showing her glimpses of a world that didn't judge someone's worth by their background or social status. A few days later, she decided to take action on her new awareness. She felt compelled to help in some way, to extend her newfound understanding into something meaningful. So she signed up as a volunteer at a community arts center in Brooklyn, not far from where David lived. It was a small gesture, but for her, it was a start. One evening, while she was at the center helping set up an art display for local artists, she felt a familiar presence. She turned around to see David standing by the entrance, his face filled with both surprise and curiosity. His expression quickly shifted to a warm smile as he walked over. "Lily?" he asked, his tone a mix of disbelief and amusement. "What are you doing here?" Lily grinned, a little shy. "I wanted to be part of this world, to learn more about it, I guess. Volunteering here felt like a good place to start." David's smile deepened, touched by her sincerity. "I didn't expect to see you here. It's good. Really good, actually." They spent the evening together at the center, helping set up art pieces from local artists, some of whom were young kids just discovering their talents. David introduced Lily to a few of his friends who were showcasing their work. She could see the admiration and respect they had for him, and realized how much of an impact he had in this community. One artist, a young girl named Amara, approached David excitedly, holding up a canvas. "Mr. David, look, I did what you showed me with the shadows." David crouched down to examine her painting, his face lighting up. "Amara, this is amazing. You've got an eye for detail. You're going to be great someday." Lily watched this interaction, feeling both admiration and a pang of shame for her past ignorance. David's influence, his mentorship, and the way he uplifted these young artists, it all showed her how much one person could impact the lives of others. And here he was, pouring himself into his community, while she had spent years focusing solely on her own bubble. After the event wrapped up, Lily and David stepped outside. The city lights flickered above, casting a warm glow on the streets. They walked in comfortable silence until they reached a small park, where they sat on a bench. Lily turned to him, her face earnest. "David, I have to ask you something," she began, her voice barely a whisper. "Go ahead," he encouraged gently. She took a deep breath, gathering her thoughts. "Do you ever get tired of trying to prove yourself, of fighting for people to see you for who you really are, instead of the labels they want to place on you?" David thought for a moment, his eyes fixed on the ground. "Yeah," he admitted. "I get tired. I get frustrated. But I also know that if I don't keep pushing, nothing will change. If I let the world decide my worth, I'll end up in a box they've built for me. I'd rather build my own path, even if it's harder." Lily's eyes filled with tears she tried to hide. She had never realized how much she had taken her own acceptance for granted. No one questioned her value, her place in the world. But for David, and for so many others, it was a daily battle. "Thank you for showing me this," she said softly, her voice filled with sincerity. "You've taught me more in the past week than I've learned in years." David smiled, brushing off her praise. "You're doing the work, Lily. I'm just glad to see you opening your eyes to a different world." They continued to talk, their conversation shifting from personal struggles to dreams and aspirations. Lily found herself opening up to him in ways she hadn't with anyone else, sharing stories of her childhood, her insecurities, and the pressure she felt to live up to her family's expectations. David listened intently, his presence reassuring. As the evening wore on, Lily's phone buzzed. It was a text from her father, reminding her of an upcoming charity gala. A pang of guilt washed over her. She realized that her life was still very much entwined with the world she was beginning to question. "Gala?" David asked, glancing at her phone. "Sounds fancy." Lily rolled her eyes, her tone slightly bitter. "Just another event where everyone pretends to care about social issues while sipping champagne and networking. It's like this endless show of who can be the most self-righteous without actually making a difference." David chuckled. "Sounds exhausting." She looked at him, a mischievous glint in her eyes. "You know, you should come with me." David blinked, taken aback. "What?" "Seriously, come with me. I'd love to introduce you to my world, just like you introduced me to yours. Plus, it would be interesting to see their reactions." He hesitated, unsure. The idea of stepping into a room full of people who might see him as nothing more than a curiosity or an outsider didn't sit well with him. But Lily's eagerness, her willingness to bridge their worlds, gave him pause. "Are you sure?" he asked, still uncertain. She nodded. "Positive. I think they need to see what real strength and resilience look like. Besides, I think you might enjoy shocking a few of them." A small smile tugged at his lips. "All right," he agreed, feeling both excited and apprehensive. "I'll go." As they parted ways that evening, both of them felt a sense of anticipation and nervousness for what was to come. Lily knew she was stepping into a new chapter of her life, one where she would no longer turn a blind eye to the world around her. David, meanwhile, prepared himself for the challenge of navigating her world, a world that had never quite welcomed him but might finally have to acknowledge his worth. In the days leading up to the gala, Lily prepared herself mentally, knowing that bringing David would raise questions, perhaps even judgment. But she was ready. She wanted people in her life to understand the depth and strength of a person they might otherwise dismiss, to see past appearances and stereotypes. David, on his part, spent time reflecting on what this night would mean for him. He had faced countless rooms filled with prejudice and skepticism before, but this felt different. It wasn't about proving himself to strangers, but about supporting a friend who was courageously confronting her own world. On the night of the gala, David stood outside the event hall, wearing a tailored suit Lily had helped him choose. He looked sharp, his confidence apparent, though he could feel the butterflies in his stomach. He took a deep breath as he watched luxury cars pull up, elegantly dressed guests stepping out, their laughter and chatter filling the night air. Just then, Lily appeared, looking stunning as Charles walked away, David turned to Lily, a wry smile tugging at his lips. "Well, that was interesting." Lily sighed, rolling her eyes. "Ignore him. My father has a very narrow view of success, and anything outside of his comfort zone makes him uncomfortable. Don't let it get to you." David nodded, though he couldn't entirely shake the feeling of being judged, not only by her father but by the entire room. He took a deep breath, grounding himself. This night wasn't about proving himself to these people. It was about standing firm in his identity, no matter what they thought. As the evening progressed, Lily introduced David to several guests, some of whom were intrigued by his work, while others barely masked their surprise at seeing him there. Despite the mixed reactions, David held his own, engaging in conversations with grace and intelligence. The more people he spoke with, the more Lily admired his resilience and poise. She could see that he was slowly breaking down stereotypes, one conversation at a time. At one point, they approached a group of women, all impeccably dressed and dripping with jewels. Among them was Rebecca, one of Lily's childhood friends, known for her sharp wit and unapologetic frankness. As soon as Rebecca saw Lily with David, she arched an eyebrow, a playful yet mischievous smile on her face. Well, Lily, you certainly know how to make an entrance," Rebecca quipped, her gaze flickering over David. "And who's this dashing mystery man?" Lily laughed, ignoring the hint of sarcasm in Rebecca's tone. "Rebecca, this is David. He's an artist, an incredibly talented one at that." Rebecca's eyes sparkled with intrigue. "An artist, huh? That's refreshing. So, David, tell me, what inspires you?" David didn't miss a beat. "People, mostly. Their stories, their struggles, their resilience. I believe every person has a narrative, and I try to capture that in my work." Rebecca tilted her head, clearly interested, though there was a glint of skepticism in her eyes. "And do you find that people here," she gestured around the room, "inspire you?" David gave a polite smile. "Every environment has its own story, though I find that real inspiration often lies outside of rooms like these." Lily stifled a laugh, loving the subtle way David was standing his ground. Rebecca, however, seemed momentarily taken aback before she let out a laugh, appreciating his boldness. "Touché, David. I like you." As the evening continued, word of Lily's unusual guest spread through the crowd, creating a buzz. Some guests approached David out of genuine interest, while others did so out of sheer curiosity. Yet, no matter the intention behind our conversations, David met each person with grace, sharing his passion for art and his experiences with unwavering authenticity. Then, as David was speaking with another guest, a man approached them, his face lighting up with recognition. It was none other than a prominent gallery owner, Jonathan Ellis, who had been at one of the art shows where David's work had been previously displayed. "David," Jonathan exclaimed, offering his hand. "It's been a while. How's the art going?" David smiled, genuinely pleased to see a familiar face. "Jonathan, it's going well, thanks. Just working on a few new projects." Jonathan turned to the group, introducing David with genuine enthusiasm. "This man here is one of the most talented artists I've seen in years. His work is raw, authentic, truly something special." The guests around them exchanged surprised glances, realizing that David wasn't just some random artist Layli had brought along, but someone who was respected in the art community. The shift in perception was palpable, as people suddenly viewed him with newfound respect. Layli's father, Charles, who had been observing from a distance, frowned, his expression shifting from skepticism to a mix of confusion and reluctant interest. He approached just as Jonathan was praising David's latest work. "Jonathan," Charles greeted, nodding. "I didn't realize you knew." "David." Jonathan beamed. "Oh, absolutely. David's work is phenomenal. He has a unique voice, something rare in today's art scene." Charles looked at David, his face unreadable. "Is that so? Perhaps I underestimated you," he said, his tone more neutral though still hesitant. David simply nodded, neither resentful nor overly gracious. He didn't need validation from Charles or anyone else in the room. He was here to represent himself, not to seek approval. As the evening drew to a close, Layli and David found themselves on the balcony, looking out over the city skyline. The cool night air was a welcome contrast to the heated energy inside. Layli turned to David, her eyes filled with pride. "You were incredible tonight," she said softly. "You showed them a world they'd never bothered to understand." David smiled, his gaze steady. "Thank you, Layli. But honestly, I couldn't have done it without you. You opened a door, and you believed in me enough to walk through it with me." They stood in silence, both of them reflecting on how far they had come. Layli had grown in ways she never imagined, seeing the world through a broader lens, unafraid to challenge her own privilege. David had found validation not through the acceptance of others, but by standing firm in his identity, unapologetic and true to himself. In that moment, they knew that they had both crossed an invisible bridge, leaving behind the limitations of perception and prejudice. They had shown the world that connections could be forged across divides, that friendship could grow from understanding, and that courage was often found in the most unexpected places. As they looked out over the city, they knew that this was only the beginning of a journey, one that would be challenging yet profoundly rewarding, filled with the kind of growth that only comes when people are willing to look beyond the surface and see each other for who they truly are. Unveiling truth and growth. The following weeks were a whirlwind for David and Layli. Their encounter at the art show had created a ripple effect, touching lives far beyond their own. David's art began gaining traction, with gallery owners and art critics now reaching out to him, intrigued by his story and captivated by his unique perspective. But it wasn't just his art that had people talking. It was the unusual partnership between him and Layli that had struck a chord. The buzz was palpable, and David found himself unexpectedly navigating the limelight, an unfamiliar but exhilarating space. Meanwhile, Layli's world had shifted in profound ways. Her interactions with David had challenged her worldview, forcing her to confront her own privilege and biases. She was no longer content with the superficial aspects of her social circle, realizing just how much of life she had been shielded from. The conversations she'd had with David and the truths he shared had opened her eyes to the harsh realities that existed just outside her sheltered world. Determined to bridge that gap, she began volunteering at local community art centers, mentoring young aspiring artists from underprivileged backgrounds. She knew she had a lot to learn, but for the first time, she felt as though she was doing something truly meaningful. One afternoon, Lily's father, Charles, called her into his office at home. She had sensed that he was still trying to make sense of her newfound friendship with David, and now, watching him settle into his leather chair, she knew this conversation had been brewing for some time. "Lily," he began, his voice softer than usual, "I wanted to talk to you about everything that's happened recently. Your friendship with David, your work at the art centers. I'm not saying I disapprove, but I'm trying to understand why you've taken such an interest." Lily met his gaze, her face calm but resolute. "Dad, I've spent so much of my life living in a bubble, surrounded by privilege and comfort. Meeting David, it was like a wake-up call. He opened my eyes to a reality I'd never fully understood, and I can't ignore that anymore. There's a whole world out there that I was blind to, and I don't want to be that person who turns away just because it's inconvenient." Charles nodded, his expression thoughtful. "You know, Lily, I didn't grow up with the kind of wealth we have now. I built this life for us, so that you'd never have to worry. But maybe in doing so, I kept you too sheltered." Lily smiled softly, reaching across the desk to take her father's hand. "You gave me a beautiful life, Dad, and I'm grateful. But it's time for me to step out of that comfort zone. David taught me that there's strength in understanding others' struggles, in facing uncomfortable truths." Charles sighed, leaning back in his chair. "David, he seems like a remarkable young man. I'll admit, I misjudged him at first. Seeing the way he handled himself at the gala. He has a quiet strength. I can see why you respect him." Encouraged by her father's words, Lily decided to go a step further. "Dad, I want to ask you something. David has been invited to showcase his work at the art gala next month. I know you have connections in the art world. Would you consider introducing him to a few people, helping him get his foot in the door?" Charles hesitated, his brows knitting together as he considered her request. "Lily, you know the art world can be brutal, especially for someone like David, who doesn't have the same background. Are you sure this is what he wants?" Lily nodded, her gaze steady. "He doesn't just want it, Dad. He deserves it. David's art tells a story that people need to hear, and he's worked so hard to get to this point. He doesn't want charity. He just needs a fair chance." After a long pause, Charles sighed and nodded. "All right, I'll see what I can do. But remember, Lily, the journey won't be easy for him. Even with support, the art world can be selective." Lily's eyes sparkled with determination. "I know, but if there's one thing I've learned from David, it's that resilience can break through even the toughest walls." In the weeks leading up to the art gala, David threw himself into his work with renewed vigor. His art studio became his sanctuary, a place where he could pour all his hopes, fears, and dreams onto the canvas. Each piece he created was a testament to his journey, a narrative woven from the experiences that had shaped him. The night of the gala finally arrived, and the gallery was packed with critics, patrons, and collectors. David stood by his display, his heart racing as he watched people observe his work. Lily was by his side, radiating pride and offering quiet encouragement. One by one, people approached David, eager to hear about his inspirations and techniques. Some were genuinely moved by his art, while others seemed curious simply because of the buzz surrounding his story. But David held his ground, answering questions with honesty and humility, letting his art speak for itself. Then, as he was speaking to a small group of guests, Charles arrived. Dressed impeccably, he made his way over to David, his expression unreadable. David tensed, unsure of how this encounter would go. But to his surprise, Charles extended his hand. "David," he said, his voice warm, "I wanted to personally congratulate you. Your work is extraordinary. I can see the passion and conviction in each piece." David shook his hand, grateful yet still cautious. "Thank you, Mr. Brighton. That means a lot." Charles nodded, glancing around the room before leaning in slightly. "And if there's anything you need, introductions, resources, don't hesitate to ask. I was wrong about you, David, and I'd like to support you however I can." For a moment, David was speechless. He hadn't expected this level of acceptance from Lily's father. The man who had once looked at him with skepticism was now offering genuine support, acknowledging him not just as an artist, but as someone worthy of respect. "Thank you, sir," David replied, his voice filled with quiet gratitude. "I won't forget this." As Charles moved on to speak with other guests, Lily turned to David, her face glowing with pride. "You did it, David. They see you now for who you are." David nodded, his heart full. He realized that this night was more than just an art show. It was the culmination of his journey, a testament to his resilience, and a validation of his worth. For the first time, he felt truly seen, not as a novelty, not as an exception, but as an artist, as a storyteller, and as an equal. As the night wore on, David found himself standing alone before one of his paintings, taking in the layers of color and meaning he had poured into it. Lily joined him, slipping her hand into his. "It's beautiful," she murmured, her voice soft with admiration. "Just like everything you've shared with me." David smiled, turning to her. "Thank you, Lily, for believing in me, for challenging me, for everything." She squeezed his hand. "It's been an honor, David. You've taught me more than you'll ever know." In that moment, they both knew that their journey together had only just begun. They were two people from different worlds, united by a shared vision, bound by a friendship that had broken barriers, shattered stereotypes, and defied expectations. And as they stood there, side by side, they knew that they were ready to face whatever came next, together.